Welcome to Chapter 4, which you can see is about unemployment and inflation. We're going to talk about different types of unemployment. Yes, there are actually different types. And the cost of unemployment. We're going to explain what inflation is and how to measure it, and talk about the two different types of inflation, and again, the costs of inflation. Unemployment. The working age population is those people, and it's stated on the slide in the negative. So those people 15 years or older, those people who are on the three territories or in Aboriginal reserves are not included in the working age population. And then full-time residents of mental or penal institutions, prisons in other words, hospital or the armed forces are not part of the working age population. Labor force is members of the working age population who are employed or unemployed. Of course, those people who are unemployed are in the labor force. Those people who are employed are in the labor force and hold a paid employment. So it is very much focused on the paycheck. If you don't get a paycheck, you're not considered to be employed. There's a lot of controversy about that. And then unemployment is those who are in the workforce and actively seeking employment, but do not hold paid employment. So somebody who is a homemaker would not be considered to be unemployed, or somebody who is, say, retired, even though they're over 15, they would not be considered part of unemployment because they're not actively seeking work. So you can see these are some statistics from Canada from 2018. And you can see that we have a fairly high percentage of people who are working age population, but the workforce is significantly smaller. It's about 2/3 the size of the working age population. And then you see the percentage that are employed, or the number that are employed, and the number that are unemployed. Here's just a visual representation of the same chart. So in this case, the participation rate, and it stayed very consistent for many years, is usually in the mid 60s, where in this case it's 65%. So simply take the labor force and divide it by the working age population. That may change now that the baby boomers are retiring, so they'd be considered part of the working age population, but they're not going to be working anymore. You can see that males have a higher participation rate than females, but it has declined over time from just under 80% to now just over 70%. And that's pretty significant. And you can see that over the last 40 years that the percentage of females working has increased dramatically, although the last 10 to 15 years, it's flattened out quite a bit. Unemployment rate is simply the number of people who are unemployed divided by the labor force. You can see the unemployment rates have changed dramatically. There was very high unemployment in the early 90s. It spiked again after the housing crisis in 2008. And this is before COVID, and we can expect there would be another spike due to COVID-19. So, and here's a short test for you. You can pause it. Otherwise, I'm just going to move forward. So if you want to participate, just pause it. So you can see the labor force includes employed and unemployed. Percentage of working population is exactly 2/3, and the rate of unemployment is exactly 10%. Different types of unemployment. Frictional unemployment is related to when people take times between jobs. So if you leave a job and you want to give yourself 2 or 3 weeks before you start your new job, then that would be frictional unemployment. There's always going to be a certain percentage of people who are between jobs, either deliberately on their own choice or involuntarily. Structural unemployment is a significant issue. because it's mismatch in skills or location. So you have somebody who's a welder and they're in Manitoba, but the job is in Prince Edward Island, or somebody who is uh, a carpenter and they're in Nova Scotia and the job is in Saskatchewan. You get the idea, or a mismatch of the skills. So that would be location or skills. And really students fit this category. Even though you may not be unemployed by the definition, you don't have the skills. And that's why you're coming to school. Cyclical unemployment is due to recessions in the business cycle where people get laid off. Natural rate of unemployment is where there's no cyclical unemployment. So you just have frictional and structural. And these people can get EI potentially. And it changes with the labor force participation and the average time to find a job. And by the way, it takes you longer to find a job if you just use online for your applications than actually contact specific companies for finding employment, or the best source is knowing people. So you can see here's the cycle for unemployment. Again, I'll let you pause this if you want, otherwise I'm just going to move ahead. Criticisms, part-time workers are included as full-time. So either employed or you're not. So if you work 8 hours a week, you're considered to be employed. It does not include discouraged workers, people who've given up. There's times when it's really hard to find a job and you just give up and don't even try. It's some people falsely state their EI claims. And then there's also people who are working in the underground economy and they're not considered to be employed. I mean, they could be, they have a job. I know circumstances where people have such a low paying wage, so they're considered to be employed, but their real source of income is from alternative sources. There's a gap between the potential GDP and the actual. This is bad for the economy because it means we could be having more. Remember, economics is about scarce resources. Well, Kuhn's law, for every 1% of cyclical unemployment, it causes 2.5% reduction in GDP. So if 2% of the population is unemployed because of cyclical unemployment, the GDP will be 5% less. So here are some calculations for you. You can see that's a significant amount of untapped GDP. Inflation, especially an issue these days, was for a long time very much under control, about 2%, maybe slightly higher at times, but that has now been changed because of COVID and the world economy. And we'll talk about why there's been inflation. We'll do that in a few moments. So again, you take you compare everything to a base year. And then they usually adjust it about every decade or so. So they take to determine the inflation rate. So core consumer price index excludes highly volatile prices. Fruits and vegetables can vary quite a bit throughout the year because of seasonality. Gas, as we've seen, gas prices go up and down, very volatile. Mortgage interest rates, there's been lots of hikes in mortgage rates. This is in the fall of 2023, over the last year and a half in particular. And again, so they exclude the highly volatile items and only include core things like that are in the basket of goods. So you have the real GDP, you have to adjust using the deflator. And again, looking at CPI and the GDP. You're trying to find the real GDP based on the, extracting or eliminating the inflation factor. So here's an example to try and turn something into what the real value is. So in this particular case, again, I'll let you pause on this. And you want to find out what the inflation rate is, so you can subtract that from the nominal increase. So the inflation rate is subtracted from the nominal increase to find out what the real GDP is. You can see that when you go from 42 billion to 45 billion, that's a 7.14% increase. You subtract the inflation rate, because that's just like a false counting, and your GDP went up by 2.2%. They rounded it, by the way. It's 2.14 if you want to get really picky. Right? There's a rule of 70, which tells you how long approximately it takes to double. So at 10%, it'll take 10 years. You simply take the interest rate divided into 70, and it'll tell you 10 years. So if it was 12%, it'd take 6 years. If it's 4%, it would take 18 years for the money to double. So if inflation is 7%, it's going to take 10 years. Just the 70 divided by the interest rate, and so it will double every 10 years. So you can use this if you say, okay, I'm starting off at $50,000 a year. I expect to get a 4% raise every year. It will take you 18 years. So if you're 22 when you start, by the time you're 40, your annual income would be 100,000. Then another 18 years later, which would be your late 50s, 58, you'll be making 200,000. So just because of the doubling effect. Inflation takes money from the economically weak. They can't afford the increases. We've seen this with rents. We've seen this with food. The wealthy people can't afford it. And so it also shifts money from lenders to borrowers because they gain. So let's say you borrow money at 7% and inflation's 5%, you're really only paying 2%. Whereas if inflation's 3%, you would actually be paying 4%. So the lenders only get the nominal rate, and the higher the rate of inflation, it eats away at that nominal rate until it can actually even be negative. Inflation can increase menu costs, revising the websites, although some of that is much easier these days. But if you have a printed copy of a menu, then it can be quite expensive to reprint. There's a famous story about in Germany about you sit down to have lunch, and by the time you're done lunch, the price had gone up. And you can see what happened. The economy collapsed, there was unemployment, and then people were angry about being out of work and having no money, and so it led to violence. You can see Zimbabwe is even worse. Every day it doubled. 25 hours anyways. So in this particular case, the real interest rate is the nominal rate minus the inflation rate. You can actually get a negative. So if inflation right now is about 4%, I know some people who got a raise of 3%, they're actually 1% worse off. So it can be negative. All right. This is honestly very unrealistic in today's world to get a real rate of return of 7%. Although I should add that would be based on the level of risk that you're willing to take, which is a little bit different. All right. Inflation can be caused by demand. In other words, tickets for Taylor Swift or Adele or Pink or whomever, the demand causes the price to go up. The cost push, which is what we're facing a lot, is the supply side, the cost of everything, the cost of fuel, the cost of wages, the cost of materials to make that product or service has gone up. So that causes the final price to also go up. So here's the summary, and I hope you've enjoyed this brief and concise presentation.